that brings me now to our next speakers, which I'm delighted to have with us, because you're going to hear now from Massey University in New Zealand and their ambitious program of sustainability and climate action. So I'm delighted now to introduce Dr. Sally Lampkin and Dr. Allannah Ryan, who will talk to you about their program at Massey University.
So firstly, thank you very much. I'm Sal, this is Allannah, to my left, Fiora Koto. Thank you to the conference organisers and the sponsors for the opportunity to speak and have ongoing discussions around this. I'm going to talk for the first 5 or 10 minutes, the first few slides, around the bigger picture of Massey in terms of sustainability and what we've been doing. I'm hoping thank you, going to allow us to carry on. So I will look at the kind of background a little bit into Massey and what we've been doing, and then Allannah will develop the presentation in terms of the student literacy international education concept. So Massey has got 3 campuses. The one in the middle here is in Palmerston North, in the North Island of New Zealand. And it started in the 1920s, 1927, as an agricultural college, and then became a university in the 60s. And then in 1993, the campus here, Albany campus up in Auckland, we expanded into that. And then most recently, we have the Wellington campus here down, which was joined us, or we expanded into the Wellington Polytechnic buildings in 1999. So we are very truly a multi-campus and complex tertiary organisation, and you can see the numbers there. These are the most recent numbers available to us here, which is interesting because almost half of it is the students are distance learning, and the 3,500 here, this is about 1/5 of the total number of internal. So this is a subset of the internal numbers. And the teaching expertise alongside the 3 campuses, we have over 2,000 hectares of farmland in the Manawatu, outside Palmerston North, and in Wairarapa, in the southern half of the North Island. And so obviously agriculture and the vet school are our strengths in that particular campus, alongside across the 3 campuses, social sciences, health, humanities, creative arts is very strong down in Wellington, business, education, and the natural sciences. So sustainability obviously used to be, as we all are aware, quite focused on compliance and environmental considerations, and now very much is looking across social justice, valuing cultural differences, economic prosperity, and regeneration. And at the bottom there, you'll see for us at Massey, we very much have a vision whereby sustainability is a consideration across, is embedded across the whole organisation and all the decisions that we make in any shape or form. We're very long way from that, but that is very much the vision that Allannah and I have been working together for coming up a year now around developing a carbon management plan, following a commitment a year or so ago by Massey to be net carbon zero, whatever that looks like, by 2030. And that's what that looks like is part of the journey that Allannah and I are developing and working towards in lots of consultation with the rest of the organisation. We have a number of sort of strings to the bow in terms of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, which are increasingly important globally, and we're endeavouring to link much more of our work not only just in the activities we do, but also the academic mission. And we have an increasing number of courses and academic modules that are based around the Sustainable Development Goals. Also, the New Zealand legislation I find quite interesting, in that it does very much support the intent of a holistic approach within this agenda. So it has the, many of you may know, the Resource Management Act back in 1991, which, though very dated now and is rapidly being updated, was at the time a landmark piece of legislation. And then we also have the Waste Strategy and the Urban Design, Land Transport Management Act, a Local Government Act, and we have a Sustainability Council that is quite core to fundamental work at the national level. And Massey also recognises the overlap and the complementary nature between the planetary concerns, the caring for people, and our aspiration to be a Tatiriti-led organisation. And there's very clear synergies between the Tatiriti approach of life and the sustainability agendas. And we work very closely with a lot of experts and the communities around that agenda, and wanting to bring that forward and develop that as part of the next decade in terms of our goals. And then finally, to bring it into the global engagement, which is the team of people here at Massey who are working in the international education area. And they're obviously really busy at the moment we're at this pivot point with obviously the omnipresent climate change. Then we've got the commitment by Massey to be net zero carbon by 2030. And we've introduced Digital Plus earlier on this year, which is around online teaching, which strengthens our online teaching capacity and research and promotes that direction. Sorry, I've just lost my thought for a moment. So the Global Environmental Department are very much focused on developing plans for what the future is going to look like. And we have 4 strains involved. So that's the international relations. So we've got over 200 institutions, agreements with over 200 institutions worldwide that we need to develop and look at what that looks like in the future. We have the transnational education, which Robin alluded to as well, with the offshore offerings, marketing and recruitment. We're looking at the dynamic and how that changes in terms of how we market what we're going in the future, what that looks like in terms of sponsors and processes, etc. And then the mobility, which is looking at the student exchange. So I think it would be fair to say that there's a lot of activity within that particular department, as I'm sure there are in other large complex institutions like our own across the world. And I think the thing that both Allannah and I have become aware of is that perhaps a disconnect that still exists across the organisation, perhaps not surprisingly, being how we're based geographically in 3 places, and are all very much focused often in our own pockets of activity. And we're looking at trying to bring some of that together and elevate it and making the whole agenda much more visible. So it's, as we're part of almost the dynamic changing environment that COVID has presented, has talks that quite loudly and enables us to develop things in a way that are more dynamic as part of that, rather than perhaps in a static way, which makes change sometimes a lot more challenging. Though I say also acknowledge obviously the tragedy around COVID alongside that. This is moving on to the specific inventory and the carbon emissions for Massey. So the number up there, we did a accredited inventory of our 2018 figures. And as you can see, it's just over 30,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent, broken up. And because of our farms, it is perhaps quite surprising that we're unique in the way that we have just under 30% of the total is from our farms. A big chunk of it is obviously in travel, and then energy, which is quite similar to the farms. We have an aviation school, which obviously has a small bit in there too, and waste. The waste is one that we spend quite a lot of time talking about because it's visible, but in reality it's a small percentage of the actual over total carbon emissions. And if we move to how that breaks down, we've got at the top here the highest, the biggest one is the long-haul air travel. Then a little further down, also air travel is in the top 10 4 times. We then get energy here, and we've got the farms bringing in another section, so it supports this pie chart really nicely. But obviously, this is the one at the top, which is perhaps slightly concerning, or at least gives us opportunities and challenges around how we change that. The bottom table there breaks it up into domestic long haul and international again for 2018, looking at which is the academics and which is the non-academic number of flights, and I'll leave you to look at the numbers around it. It's really reflecting that it's not, there is a lot of scope there for us to improve our understanding around why a lot of the travel is happening. The figures that we've included up here don't include, for example, the students travel across when they're coming to New Zealand or to Massey specifically. This is the staff-related flights. And is it also research?
Yes.
Fieldwork? Yeah. Yes. So staff and students doing fieldwork around that. So there's a lot of scope, and it's ongoing discussions we have around how we can understand more about that and look at moving forward and changing what it is we need to change and what we need to make sure that we don't lose what's core to the business of Massey, and then also the opportunities of things that we can improve and do better moving forward. So the type of work that I particularly focus on is looking at the people and the culture and practices. Organisational change is my academic background. So Allannah and I bring a complementary focus, because her experience, and she will talk more about that when she speaks in a minute, is around the strategic academic mission and the external partners and how Massey fits into the national and global international scenes. And my focus is very much looking at the team of 33,000 as we have, and bringing them along the pockets. Currently, we're at quite an infancy stage in terms of embedding sustainability in that mission, which I showed a couple of slides back. And we've got pockets of activity and energy, a couple of rather large departments like the vet school and the library, and COCO, which is the creative arts department down in Wellington, that have got a lot of energy and experience and activities have been going on. And we've got equally so pockets across up in Auckland as well, pockets of people who are very committed to this agenda, and it talks in their academic work or their research as well as just their personal lifestyle. So part of my work initially is joining the dots, really, is bringing those people together in conversations along with the work that Allannah does, and working around the spheres of influence of people, and the ongoing iterative process of activities over the next few years will enable Massey to, in this agenda, move into the maturity by doing small incremental changes, leading by example, a couple of the things that Robin mentioned, and enable us to make large-scale transformation changes across culture and practices. And I just was going to focus on the collaborative approach that entails, which I think is part of the disconnect I mentioned a moment ago. We need to address that. And the farms is an area where we've done, Allannah and I have done some work specifically to that. And I'll hand over to Allannah to explain what that might look like within the international education sector moving forward.
Sure, thank you. So I want to talk a little bit about international education and its impact on greenhouse gas emissions, but I want to start by saying, before I put any pictures up there, is to kind of say that really we've done nothing in this space. So just get that out there. We've had a few informal conversations with our colleagues in international education, part of the university. Certainly this has come up in conversation with staff and students about our climate action plan. But in terms of the focus of the work that we've been doing around our carbon management plan and a pathway to being a low carbon university, this is really not figured. So it was actually really great to get the invitation to speak today, because it forced us, I guess, to look at this issue and to start thinking about how we're going to develop this as a conversation in the university. And I'm really interested to hear what will come out of the discussions later on in the kind of question and answer session later, because I think it will help us to clarify our ideas a little bit about the space and to start working on it. So just to sort of start, I'd say one of the things we need to kind of start with is to look at what we know about Massey's international education footprint, if you like. So there's an illustration there of where our students come from currently. So that's from the annual plan last year. So we do know where our students come from. We know pretty much what they're studying, but there's a lot we don't know if we start to look at the issue around climate change and the impact of their travel. So we don't know how often students travel between their home country and New Zealand. And neither do we know the proportion of our footprint which is generated by international education, including both staff and students. So we can extract information about staff business travel, so we have that information as part of our inventory, but we haven't done the work yet to see what that is. But at the moment we couldn't really tell you what the carbon footprint of our international students is. However, there was a small piece of work which was done in the summer before last by some students who were trying to put together what they called a carbon strategy for the university. They did, this is very much what I would call a guesstimate, but they looked at students based on the Manawatu campus in Palmerston North, international and domestic. And they made a number of assumptions about how often they might fly home given where their residence is. So for international students, they assumed that students might go back once during the year, as well as coming at the beginning of the year, and for domestic students possibly 3 times. On the basis of that guesstimate, they've come up with a figure which includes both radiator forcing and excluding it. So if we were just to use this as a very high level ballpark bit of a guesstimate, around 14,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalent might be associated with the international travel of students just from one of our campuses. So that, if we were to include that in our carbon inventory, is obviously a big issue for the university. If we don't include it in the inventory, it's still a big issue in terms of the contribution that our business has, I suppose, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So really important for us to start to get a kind of a handle on understanding, I suppose, what the size of the problem is, but obviously the more important question is what to do about that. Now, as I sort of started by saying, is that we have really done nothing in this space. And so in thinking about what to talk about today, I thought, well, if I had to think about what we were doing around the farms, and because initially that for us was an area which we needed to understand in order to do something about. So I thought, well, maybe that's a way to start thinking about how do we start thinking about what the impact of international education is on our greenhouse gas footprint, and then what to do about that. So I just wanted to kind of raise, I suppose, the question of what we've learnt from the work we've done about the farms, and then move towards what that might mean in terms of thinking about international education. So in terms of the issue of the farms, we really needed to know what to measure and what was important to measure. And in doing so, we've come to a much more nuanced understanding of where the emissions associated with our farms come from. So the pie chart on the left there isn't actually Massey University figures, but because we're still working that out. But it does give you a sense of where we need to understand the emissions associated from different animals and the different kinds of gases that are also associated with those animals. And then at the farm level, we need to understand what the emissions are on each of the different farms, because they have different farming systems. Some are more intensive than others. Some have different kinds of research on them. So that was a really important piece of work for us to do for the farms. And I started to think about international education. Well, I think we need to ask the question, what's important to measure in terms of international education? So that's still very much a question for us. So do we need to understand, and to what level of granularity do we need to understand where our students come from and how much business travel is associated with international education? I think we do, but we haven't done that work yet. And I guess there's a question which I might ask later is, from the experience of people who are in the room, virtually speaking, what do you think we as a sector should be doing in terms of measurement? So measuring is just the first place to start, I guess. Much more importantly is generating a strategic vision and then a plan for what to do once you understand what the size of the problem is. So in terms of the work around the farms, we've done a number of things which are helping us get to a position of understanding where we want to be by 2030 and beyond, and a plan to get there. So we established a farms working group which provides oversight of the process and generates ideas, a modelling research group which was much more focused on understanding alternative farm systems and management and the impact on emissions and so forth. We've undertaken stakeholder interviews with researchers who use the farms, because we need to understand the current practice, the concerns of researchers, and what new ideas might exist for how we could manage the farms differently. It's important for us to connect with the governance body around the farms, so the Massey Agricultural and Horticultural Enterprises Advisory Committee, big mouthful. Very important though in terms of finding some alignment with the way that the farms are managed and a strategic vision around farms and agriculture. And then all of those things are helping us generate what we're calling a roadmap to low carbon farms. So this will have a time frame which is mapped to the senior leadership team process. A vision is starting to emerge because of the work we've done through all of those parts of the process. And obviously we want it to be about not just cutting emissions. That's not very exciting or visionary. So what would that mean? For us, we're thinking it might mean leading Aotearoa New Zealand's transition to a low carbon agriculture and horticultural sector. And it's been really important in this process to get the right people in the room. And so in terms of the farms, that's been academics, farm managers, academic managers, external stakeholders, and students, I would add there too. So all of that doesn't necessarily translate exactly to the international education sphere, but in terms of thinking about it as a process, it starts to help me think a little bit about what we might do. And I guess coming to what we would do next is, many of you will have seen this. This is, I think, quite a nice way of thinking about the whole kind of collaborative process. If you're trying to create change, what does that look like? I would say that in terms of the farms, we're definitely at the moment in the grown zone. We're trying to understand different frames of reference, different visions for the farms, trying to marry that up with SLT, with money and so forth. And we're hoping that over time we'll get into a convergent zone where there will be a vision and some decisions, and we will be on a new pathway for those farms. Now, if I'm thinking that now about international education, I would say we're right at the left-hand side of that image. It's a new topic. We're pretty much doing business as usual. And I would like to think that pretty soon we'll start to get into that grown zone. And what would that mean? I think it would mean trying to bring an alignment between sustainability and international education. At the moment, those agendas haven't traditionally been aligned. They're certainly not really aligned at Massey currently. And then we might start to think about these kinds of questions. So going back to the slide earlier, what do we need to measure? Who needs to be in the room? How should the work connect to the university business, which is already happening, and to various committees? And if we're going to have a process around this, I'm assuming that it might generate some step change, because I'm interested in the transformation, I guess, of things that, say, Robin was talking about earlier. So what process will generate that? Now, for me, and I think for Sal, these are still very much questions. We don't know the answers to them. We're kind of in a space where we'd like to sort of start thinking through how to set up that process and to work that out over time. So I think I will stop there, because I think I'll kind of hopefully raise some questions which we might be able to discuss in the next part of this session. So I think we will stop sharing our screen now and handle questions and so on.
Thank you very much both. Thanks, Sally and Allannah. That was really fabulous. And I suppose it makes me feel, we're already winning, I think, if the fact that this event has prompted you guys to think more about how international education and your work interact is going to have some real benefits, I think. So I'd like to focus in a little bit. I'm sure we might get some other questions coming through, but first of all, I'd like to bring it back to the question of flying, because we know that in international education, our business models are very heavily dependent, or have been up until now, on binge flying, really, both in terms of the students coming in to the country, and also in terms of the way that international recruitment and international partnerships tend to be managed. So I understand you have a partnership with Air New Zealand, and I'm wondering if you could talk us through that, and also perhaps respond to some of the criticisms that are often levelled about offsetting and how that fits into the mix.
Sure. So for the last 2 years, for 2018 and 2019, the university, so at the senior leadership team level, a decision was made that we would offset our Air New Zealand flights. So that's through the program called Fly Neutral. So what that program does is, at the end of the year, Air New Zealand tells us how many tons of CO2 equivalent we've generated. So for the 2018, it was 4,667. And so we bought offsets to, I suppose, compensate for those. I would say that actually there were quite a few staff and students in the university who did think that was a bit of a cop-out, in the sense of, it's like a kind of, maybe it's a get out of jail free card, or makes us feel better, us included. Other staff have been actually appreciative of it, because they say it does does make a difference, and in a sense we tried to choose projects that, so about half of the projects that that were funded by the payment we made, which was about 120,000 New Zealand dollars for that year, were Indigenous plantations in New Zealand, and then some were some international projects to do with solar stoves. I can't remember what the others were. So we're very aware that there are issues with that approach, and so one of the things we didn't really talk about was that we're looking at using carbon insetting as a university, which would mean that we would have an asset that we would grow Indigenous and exotic hardwoods together, which would be a permanent forest, which would create an asset forever in the sense of sequestering carbon. It could also be useful for researchers who do work on forestry and agriculture and the combination of them. So a decision hasn't been made yet about that as an approach, but personally, I think that's a better way to go than buying carbon credits, because it does give us an asset which has a lot of benefits beyond simply sequestration and making us feel good.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Yes, and I love that carbon insetting approach rather than offsetting. And one of the things I remember being so impressed by when I first read about some of your work was that you were trying to take this really holistic view of what is needed across the whole institution in order to reduce or eliminate potential sources of emissions. So, for example, you were looking at investing in better audiovisual technology so that you could actually do some of your core work virtually rather than having to fly. Is that something that you've found that you'll continue to do in future?
Most definitely. I think it's part of the core business moving forward to Digital Plus, which I believe what you're referring to is being very heavily invested in, supported across the board at senior management and lower down. And yes, it has created a dynamic of change and uncertainty, and we're part of that process of discussion across the academic colleges around how that falls out. COVID jumps into the same situation. We've obviously got very strong online teaching as a university anyway, so there's a strength there that we can develop. So there's plenty of scope, and I don't know whether Allannah wants to add to that, but definitely very cool business moving forward and very exciting in terms of potential and in terms of keeping the international education agenda.
Yeah, wonderful. And I think it was really interesting as well to hear about how, there hasn't necessarily to date been a really close alignment between international and the sustainability streams of work within Massey. And I think most universities and most educational institutions are probably in a very similar boat. And I think that there will be a kind of convergence of those two over the next few years. I think it has to happen, but you're obviously at the forefront of that. And I wonder if you could just give any comments on what you see the potential role of the international office at Massey could be. Are there ways that they could be your ally and actually help support you in your push to make changes across the university?
I would say that personally, many of them working in the office are personally committed to the sustainability agenda, and so we have had informal conversations. I think at the moment they're in a process of trying to understand the big shift that COVID really is making everybody think. And at the moment, there's a sense in which they're very busy doing kind of catch up, and it's there's stuff which is right here in front of them and having to cope with as a university. So I don't feel really confident at the moment to kind of be able to say what the next step would be, but I'm certainly aware that because of their own personal commitment, they are understanding that things are going to change anyway, that actually the thinking that we're doing around sustainability and having low carbon futures might actually give some impetus to their work, so that it provides a sense of we can't just keep doing what we have done and kind of just fixing things up a little bit at the edges. We've got to think about this radically differently. So, in a way, this is kind of a perfect moment to bring the two agendas together, because it's really a problem, but it's also an opportunity. So, I'm hoping that will start to happen.
Yeah, absolutely it is. And thank you both so much for your time today and for putting in so much preparation and for sharing your insights. It's been really valuable. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.